Hi, Glenn.
Hi, Megan. How are you?
I'm pretty well, and how are you? I understand you're recovering from surgery.
I'm doing okay now that I've emerged from the fog of opiates. I had a complete knee replacement in my left knee on the 30th of June, and here we are, August 2nd, so I guess I'm almost 5 weeks past it. And I'm doing okay. I mean, it's healed up nicely, and I'm struggling with physical therapy stuff and trying to get more angle of flex on the knee and all of that and strength. But so far so good.
Well, I think we should come back and talk about this later as a reflection on U.S. healthcare policy. But first,
all right. First,
the amazing
course.
theater that we just went through as a nation.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I was one of the people who was saying, not that I didn't think there was going to be a deal, because I always thought there was a greater than 50% chance that there was, but that it seemed more in jeopardy than the people that I was talking to on both Wall Street, mostly on Wall Street, were saying that they accused me of young pundit syndrome, where I've been in Washington for 4 years, and I've only seen so much of this, and so naturally I freak out when the negotiations get tough, and everyone was saying, they'll settle down eventually. But it struck me that actually a lot of the sort of institutional checks that are supposed to make it easier to move legislation are actually eroding a little bit, at least in part because of some of the good government stuff that people are trying to do. For example, the earmarks that, the Republicans tried to cut down on earmarks.
Yes. And
they had this whole pork busters thing even before Obama was elected. But that, in fact, the earmarks made it very difficult to get the Tea Party, the lack of earmarks made it more difficult to get the Tea Party to come on board and actually sign on to a deal because there was no carrot, right? You couldn't promise them something in their district. And the sticks were also pretty attenuated because they didn't really have a legislative agenda. Their legislative agenda was don't raise the debt ceiling.
Hold on, let me stop you on this point about, because I find it really very interesting. I heard this too reported, that the fact that you didn't have pork barrel politics as usual with very individual member-specific appropriations in the form of earmarks made it hard to horse trade because you didn't have anything to give. So that is really interesting to me because it's like the ability to carry on transactions depends upon the existence of a kind of unit of account or commonly accepted currency or easily fungible thing that's something like money. And in the kind of horse trading politics of Congress, earmarks turn out to, at least in part, serve the purpose of this kind of money, this kind of lubricant, permitting trade between members, which otherwise wouldn't be possible, something like that.
Yeah, it's almost like cigarettes.
Cigarettes in prison, yeah.
Germany, right? Or in prison, yeah. And I sort of give credence to this. I've heard it argued that, for example, the corruption, the legendary corruption of city machines like Tammany Hall in New York,
yeah.
that in fact this was a way of getting things done, and that if you look at the post-good government reform system of New York City, it's inarguably, I think, less corrupt. But it's also, I think, inarguably less capable of doing things like the New York City subway system, which was basically built out between 1904 and 1911. And then there were, expansions after that. But they did this enormous project in basically 7 years, where if you look at getting the Second Avenue subway built, it's been on the boards one way or another since the Great Depression, basically, and it hasn't been done, and it's only
because
now
of
finally getting done.
Is it NIMBY type of problems,
I think there's a lot of things. There's the NIMBY check. So you gave people more checks. We looked at the abuses of Robert Moses, right? And so we wanted to give people, communities especially, but people as individuals as well, more checks against the power of the state.
Yeah.
And that was a good thing. The bad thing is that it now costs a phenomenal amount of time and money. But there's also to get these projects done. But there's also the Philip Howard argument that the amount of just checks on corruption that we have, all of this bureaucratic process, a lot of it is aimed at making sure that people aren't stealing the money that the government gave them or living high on the hog with our tax dollars. And that it's probably, or it's at least arguably, more expensive to have all of these checks than it would be to have a low level of corruption. And I'm not sure I entirely buy it, but on the other hand, I remember talking to a bank president who had gone into, I believe, North Carolina state government. And he said, the first day he was there, he wanted to call a meeting with all of the people who directly reported to him and order sandwiches. And the secretary was like, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't order sandwiches. Because it was viewed as some sort of extravagant waste.
Yeah.
And if you let them do this, the state employees will be feeding themselves sandwiches on the taxpayers every day of the week and twice on Sundays.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's a kind of point in here about formal and informal, the benefit of informal ways of trying to do things, and even though the informal may admit of some abuse and irregularity, it also has a certain flexibility or adaptability, something like that.
Yes. What are your thoughts on that? Is that
crazy? Well, I think that in the context of, for example, laws against the paying of bribes by American corporations to officials abroad. And I think, and I say this without trying to advocate the paying of bribes, I'm not advocating it at all. I thought, at one level, if there is a well-established practice and expectation, then you might place your domestic company at a competitive disadvantage in an environment where that kind of behavior is commonplace. And I also thought in a developing country, let's say, with a not especially well-established rule of law or culture of kind of bureaucratic conformity and responsibility, it may be that kind of the only way you can get something done is by going around the official system, which requires a kind of off the books and a kind of underground maneuver. But that, from the point of view of overall economic efficiency, that could well be an improvement relative to the kind of ossified system of regulation and prerogative and whatever that goes along with some established bureaucracy. So I guess that's all by way of saying it's never been clear to me that the kind of corruption understood in the formal sense of transactions contrary to some established legal rule meant to regulate them. It's never been altogether clear to me that corruption was a bad thing. I mean, it seems to me there have been plenty of examples where a little bit of corruption was necessary to get anything done. But that's just an idle observation.
Well, but then you have this problem of, I did a piece on Iraq about 6 months back, and one of the really interesting things was an economist who's a Lehigh economist who ended up as he's also a reserve military officer, so he just ended up in Iraq and ended up as the chief economics advisor to the military there for a while. And he said that post-war, what's developed in Iraq is a sort of entrepreneurial corruption, where the more rules there are, and the more of these sort of inefficient laws that you need to get around, the more opportunities there are for graft. And so you have agencies and departments in the government competing with each other to build up a totally unworkable edifice of regulations so that they can charge people for getting around it. So obviously,
that can't be efficient.
Well, the thing is, right, you need a little bit of grease, but you don't actually want to soak your engine in it. And I assume it's sort of the same thing. It's you need a little bit of lubricant. And if you don't have some way to trade, it's almost, in a way, when you think about Congress, it's like barter, right? Is the problem with barter is that maybe there's someone who wants your horse,
yeah,
and I want the cart, but how do you arrange that transaction so that we're all happy?
It's the double coincidence of wants, probably used to call it.
Yes. So how do you, barter is not an efficient way to do it.
Right.
And when you have money, you can lubricate the system, and you can, and that's the sort of core problem of Congress is that if you don't have something like earmarks, you're left with incredibly incommensurable policy positions that are hard to resolve in a way that allows for governance of the country.
It's such an interesting point, and again, I think I want to qualify anything I say, not knowing for sure whether earmarks, on the whole, do more harm than good. But just the observation that they could do any good whatsoever strikes me as interesting.
Right.
And it's another illustration of a kind of one of these paradoxes of reform where you go in to clean up, good government and all of that, and it's because you don't understand the complexity of the system, you end up, maybe doing harm where you think it could only be that you would do good, and there are going to be many examples of that. So, but anyway, what do you make, being in Washington, if only for 4 years, of this now apparently terminating conflict, debate, epic debate over extending the debt ceiling? Winners, losers, criticism of the process, evaluation of the outcome?
Well, I criticize the process in that I don't think that what the Republicans did, I think they won some concessions. I don't think the concessions were nearly as great as the progressives are now screaming. I think they won something. I certainly think, and maybe we can talk about this in a minute, that Obama was diminished in this face-off. But I see this basically as the result of two kind of long-standing trends, and one is that in the 70s you had a couple things going on. You had the realignment, the slow realignment of the South, and that really changed a lot. You used to have conservatives and liberals within the parties of both parties because the South was this weird creature, and now you have conservatives in one party and liberals in another. You also had the overthrow of the committee system in the House, and it used to be that really there were like four. My understanding of it, anyway. I was, one when this happened, but
of course,
is that there used to be like 4 or 5 powerful guys in the House who basically ran anything, and so Lyndon Johnson could basically go to the House and say, "I want this," and they would negotiate, but they could deliver once they had negotiated a deal. They could deliver it, and in the early 70s after Nixon, or I guess the mid-70s, that the progressives mostly overthrew that system and they demanded a lot more say. But the result, I think, has been a long breakdown in bipartisan comedy. And I think it's been going on for a while. I think it's pervaded the Senate. And I think it's things like from Bork onwards, right? There's been this escalating war, and each side thinks the other side started it, of I'm going to press a little further, abuse the process a little bit more. And I thought that was really terrible. I didn't think what the Republicans got was in any way worth that. And I think that the other trend, aside from the trends in like partisanship and political development, is just that, look, entitlements, the baby boomers are now retiring. They're going to be really expensive. There's going to be huge pressure on the budget. It's leaving no one any wiggle room. And that means we're going to actually, for the first time, really have to make tough choices about what we want to spend money on, how much tax we're willing to pay to cover it, and that those are going to be ugly. And that this was the opening battle in what I expect to be a very long war.
Yeah, on that last point, I hear you. And the 2012 presidential election will be a big referendum on this. Do you not think so?
Well, I think the problem is that it is and it isn't, because the American public does not understand the problem, right? Like Republicans all think that, this is way too broad a brush. A lot of Republicans think that the core problem is taxes and regulation. If you just sweep that away, we'll generate enough growth to somehow deal with, they don't actually want to cut Medicare and Medicaid or Social Security. Or they certainly don't want to be caught in public saying that they do, right? And it's not a real cut. This is also true of the Democrats. They don't want to admit anything they're doing is actually going to impact anything that happens to baby boomers. It's only like, we're just going to cut provider payments. Like, this has nothing to do with the kind of treatment you get.
But you and I know that neither of those are realistic views of the scores of trillions of dollars of unfunded liability that Medicare and Medicaid imply going forward, given the demographics.
Well, I think the question is, how long can they keep lying, right? How long until it just becomes completely obvious that all of the weird promises of how we're going to fix this through the magic of, IPAB which I feel like IPAB, which is this provider payment institution that is supposed to recommend automatic cuts that are insulated from the normal political process, if it stands, and there's some question about whether it will. But it's now becoming like the Laffer curve of the left.
I'm sorry, what is it? What is it?
It's an independent. It's called IPAB. It's an independent payment advisory board for Medicare. And what it does is, if cost growth exceeds a certain level, it recommends these cuts, these automatic cuts that have to be made.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I'm so ignorant. I didn't even know what that was. Okay.
Sorry, I'm way deep in the health.
IPAB. Yeah, we didn't get that in Providence, Rhode Island. But anyway, no. I'm sure somebody in Providence got it. It just got past me.
But every time the Democrats now need money, they just change, they fiddle with the growth rate above which IPAB is going to make these cuts, right?
Oh, I see.
So it was nominal GDP plus 1, and now the Obama administration needs money, so they want to make it NGDP plus 0.5. The next step is obviously NGDP, and then it goes down from there rapidly, right? But the cuts don't need to be realistic. They just have to be in law, because that's how the Congressional Budget Office will assess this policy.
Well, that's just playing with numbers. I mean,
yeah.
That doesn't alter the reality in the least.
But it doesn't, it can conceivably, but what they want to believe is that it's not going to affect treatment. And that's ridiculous, right? Then you can't just keep endlessly slashing provider salaries and expect that nothing happens on the other end. And so when they were in the recent budget deal, they did some Medicare cuts, or they were originally going to do some Medicare cuts, and said, but this is only for providers. It's not going to affect beneficiaries. This is...
As if providers are not going to respond when their revenues go down?
Exactly. This is the theory, anyway. So, on the other hand, I think that everyone likes to lie to voters about these magic pots of money they've found, and it seems to work really well. So I think the question is, when does that stop working as an electoral strategy? I don't know if it's 2012.
Yeah, I see. But the political argument is now framed, is it not, by this recent budget debt ceiling extension battle, as between those who think that government is too big and that taxes are too high, whether or not they believe that supply-side business about how by lowering or changing taxes you can get a growth spurt that'll pay for what appears to be the deficit in the social fisc. Whether they believe that or not, there's still this argument that government is too big and that taxes are too high, versus a different kind of argument, a shared sacrifice argument, a investment in the sort of core public goods and innovation and scientific research and development of manpower resources for the future, and stimulate in the face of a cyclical downturn argument. That argument is framed, is it not, by this that divide. The austerity types and the people worrying about the debt we're imposing on our grandchildren, and who basically think government should be 20%. 20% of GDP? I don't know how we meet all of our commitments and keep our military footprint that we have and all the rest, and also deal with our expanding obligations under the social insurance programs with an aging population. By having government be smaller, considerably smaller than the federal government than it is right now. But in any case, that seems to me to be the argument.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, you bring up something that's been on the agenda, been on the talking points, starting to be here in Washington, which is that you're setting up this coming battle between the parties. I think that on the right, the tax cutters are going to have to decide whether they want the military or not. And the defense hawks kind of belatedly woke up to this as this deal was being finalized.
Yeah.
That, if you don't want to raise taxes, then you're probably going to have to take a big chunk of money out of the military, which is, great for the libertarians, but makes a bunch of other people upset. And I think for the Democrats, because they have been so identified as the party of defending entitlements, and so dug down into nothing major except provider payments can ever change in entitlements, right? You can't cover any fewer people than you cover right now. They're going to have to decide, I think, ultimately whether they want to take care of poor people or old people, because I don't think you can do both. I think Medicaid, for example, the need to pay for nursing home care is going to completely eat the budget for giving care to poor people. And the thing is that seniors vote at a much higher rate. And also, you look at the middle class people whose parents may be in a nursing home on Medicare, Medicaid, and they don't really want to try to pay that bill because those bills are huge. $100,000 a year they can be. So that I think that when push comes to shove, unless Democrats get serious about reforming it now, down the road, what's going to happen is that the money going to old people is going to basically eliminate the safety net for everyone else.
Now, what I find interesting about what you're saying here is on both sides, both on the Republican side with the opposition between if you don't want any tax increases, then you better be prepared to tolerate some cuts in the military budget. And on the Democratic side, in this opposition between a welfare state that extends a social safety net, especially to the most needy, versus a ossified and overcommitted welfare state that is dug in with respect to historically generated programs that are now benefiting a constituency that, talk about the elderly,
Right.
middle class elderly. I mean, like my dad and my stepmom who are in their 80s, retired in Florida with 2 brand new SUVs in the garage outside, even though, neither gets driven more than 5 miles a day. That opposition. And what I'm seeing is similar between the two is a kind of irrationality, because those shouldn't be the choices. I mean, whatever I may think about tax policy or about the U.S. military posture, the idea that the either-or is either I raise taxes in order to meet the fiscal thing, but I don't want to raise taxes, then therefore it has to come out of the military. Why? Because the constellation of political preferences has a block of those we call them Republicans who both oppose tax increases and favor military spending. Therefore, we kind of lock them in and incentivize them to be reasonable by opposing the one to the other, which doesn't strike me as rational. I mean, the military budget should be decided on the basis of the merits, and then that should be factored into the overall fiscal demands, and then tax policy should be set based on the overall fiscal demands, not this category-specific trade-off between taxes and the military. And likewise, the fact that the party of socially liberal policy finds itself maybe hoisted on its own petard a little bit, or at least pushed into a corner or forced to confront a conflict between aid to elderly, which may be overly generous to the middle-class elderly, or certainly needs to be rethought on one hand, and provisions for the poorest people in the country. That shouldn't be the trade-off, and the fact that the poor don't vote as much as the elderly do shouldn't determine that allocation. But
Well, I think you've got as parties who've decided on a position of, here's the hard line. And the hard line that they picked, I agree with you, is kind of silly, right? Like, no new taxes ever doesn't really tell you, you want to think about the cost-benefit of taxes. And I tend to, be in favor of limiting government as much as possible. I would much prefer a Social Security program that took good care of people who can't care for themselves and let everyone else care for themselves, and so forth, rather than sort of these really broad middle-class entitlements. But whatever your preference on that is, you start with a cost-benefit and decide whether you want to pay for it, whether it's worth paying for. You don't say, well, taxes should be 18% of GDP, and what can we fit into 18% of GDP? And I think there's declining, right? As taxes go higher, this sort of added cost on a lot of dimensions gets higher. The cost of raising taxes from 20 to 25% of GDP is higher than the cost of raising them from 15 to 20% of GDP. But Democrats have picked no entitlement cuts, right? Like with the exception of provider cuts in Medicare, but no actual changes to the way, no substantive changes to the way the programs work, unless those are program expansions. You cannot have a program cut. You can't block grant Medicaid to states. You can't, means test Medicare, none of it. Nothing can change in a downward direction. It can only go up. And that's, if those are your two hard lines, and I think those are the lines that the parties are coalescing around, then what you're going to end up with is these trade-offs, which I agree with you are kind of silly. They shouldn't be the trade-offs, but I think we're making them the trade-offs.
But I wonder if you share my impression that with respect to articulating a clear, simple, forceful, and at least to sound appealing ideological line, that the right is really doing much better than the left these days. That's my impression. I'll just declare it. I mean, not that I share the right-wing line about government's in the way, too much regulation, taxes, it's your money, you should be able to keep it. It's just that, all of that stuff fits on a few bumper stickers and really resonates, and I can see, talk show hosts getting grist for their mill for years out of it. And it kind of, articulates well with the at least populist sentiment that is widespread in some elements of the polity. Whereas, unions. How about a clear defense of labor unions as an essential element of the political economy of a social democracy, or social policy more generally? The president utters from time to time words about shared sacrifice and mutual obligation, but most of the time I hear people using phrases like middle-class families, which I'm not against, of course, but it sort of like begs the question of what about the needy? I mean, it's like nobody wants to be for the actual needy, or nobody is too strong, but you know what I mean? I mean, the sort of modal rhetoric doesn't even bother to try to defend the idea. Redistributionist policy is just like an ugly, nasty word. The president says anything about some people making more money than other people, and that should have an impact on what we do. And his opponents utter class warfare, and that seems to be the last word in the discussion. Or am I? Do you think that I'm off in this judgment? That I think the right is winning the kind of populist rhetorical battle of the framing of their ideology in ways that can have mass appeal.
Well, I would say that I think that Democrats and Republicans have different structural advantages, and I agree that a lot of the stuff, including the stuff that's wrong that Republicans say, is really easy to explain, right? So you say, I don't want taxes to go up. Well, that's a pretty simple thing to say. Taxes shouldn't go up. Okay, we know what that is. We know what it looks like. And it's something that resonates with ordinary people because they feel like they pay taxes. Most of them don't pay the taxes that we're actually talking about raising or lowering, but that's neither here nor there. They feel like they do. They get the payroll tax. It feels like a tax to them. But at the same time, Republicans are always lamenting, and I think fairly, that there's this enormous status quo bias in the things that they want to change. So you can't touch Medicare, right? Anytime the Democrat wants to win against a Republican, all they'd have to say is he tried to change Medicare. He tried to change Social Security. He's going to take away your housing tax deduction, whatever it is, right? Any change that Republicans try to make gets voted down because it's a pocketbook issue. And so for Republicans who want those reforms, Democrats have a huge built-in advantage because they're just advocating don't change anything. And you and I both know that that's not fiscally sustainable, right? We're going to have to make choices.
Right.
But
look at how the Paul Ryan plan fared as a political matter, whatever its policy merits.
Right. Exactly. That the argument on Paul Ryan is not, well, $8,000 isn't a big enough voucher. It's he's trying to end Medicare as we know it.
Right.
And that's, maybe he is, and we're going to get something better, right? You don't. So I think that they're different, and I also think that in a lot of ways, to go back to what I said before, I think they're dangerous, that these very simple talking points that both sides have make it almost impossible at this point to deal with the huge problem we have of both parties are going to have to hold hands and jump together off the cliff of entitlement reform and higher taxes and all the rest of it. If one party does it, the other party will just get swept in to undo it. So they're going to have to kind of do something at the same time. And God, I don't see any...
Yeah, we're a long way from that, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so what about President Obama's leadership? You said he looked diminished, and that certainly is the rap out there. I mean, I read a column by Elizabeth Drew, I think, maybe a week ago or something like that, in which she remarked specifically on the president's I've now been left twice at the altar comment during one of those press conferences that he was giving during the height of the debate. And Elizabeth Drew, the veteran observer of politics in Washington, D.C., says, it was a horrible thing to behold. One wanted to avert one's gaze, the incredible shrinking presidency. He's the president of the United States, and the best that he can manage to do is complain to the American public that he's been left at the altar, she says. Or I read Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal, admitted a Republican, who is saying, in effect, Obama the loser, nobody likes a loser. I hear reports from credible sources that the Democratic caucus in the Senate and the House are complaining about the president's lack of leadership and so forth. I see him apparently being outmaneuvered by the likes of John Boehner and so forth. I see him being walked out on by people and being cut out of the process. I don't know, man. Doesn't look that good to me.
Well, you and I both supported him, I think. Is that right?
I'm sorry, say it again?
General.
Say it again, I didn't hear you.
I supported him for the general. Did you?
I voted for him over the other guy, McCain. Yeah, I voted for Barack Obama. I supported Hillary Clinton in the primaries. People will not let me forget, but that's okay. I definitely voted for Barack Obama in the general election in 2008.
I would have voted for him if I had not missed the D.C. voter registration deadline, like the idiot I am. But I moved, and I just didn't. I sort of didn't get it together in time. But I think my take on him, and there are a lot of things that I still really fond of his economic team. I think they've done a lot of good. They've really done, I think, as much as they could reasonably have been expected to about the financial crisis. I do not agree with all of their decisions, obviously, but given tough times and the fact that they don't agree with me on a bunch of stuff, okay. But I think that starting with healthcare, the thing that strikes me about Obama is that he has never wanted to take the risk of being the guy who proposes something voters don't want. Yeah. And so he let Congress go out there, and maybe because he learned the lessons of Hillary care too well, he let Congress go out there and spend a year developing a plan, and he never put anything forward really other than these incredibly broad goals, right? It shouldn't cost more than this, whatever. And at the time I said, well, I took the lessons of Hillary care too much to heart. I think that was a really bad decision in a lot of ways. But I don't think, I'm less inclined to credit the idea that he merely was trying not to repeat the mistakes of the Clinton administration, because he's done it over and over again. He wants other people to go out there and put their necks on the line, and then he'll come in and sign it and say, well, I have to sign what they sent me. And, he sets these incredibly broad goals, but he's never out there with a plan. And whatever you say about the Bush administration, when he wanted to do something that people didn't like Social Security privatization, that he thought was the right thing, his administration was out there pushing for it and visibly pushing for it. Yep. And I think that unwillingness to take a loss is actually possibly going to cost him the presidency, also a terrible economy, don't get me wrong. But I think that it makes him look weak.
Well, let me tell you what I'm hearing that Larry Summers is saying. I'm hearing this from economists around here in Boston, Cambridge, that Larry is saying, so Paul Krugman says the stimulus package was too small, and that's at least one of the reasons why we're still stuck. And the Republicans, of course, are saying failed stimulus plan and so forth, when, of course, the right question is what would it have been with no stimulus at all. But what I hear that Summers is saying is, look, man, that stimulus package that we had would have been a lot more bang for the buck if we had been allowed to design how the money was going to be spent. But instead, the president deferred to Congress to constitute the various elements of the sort of microstructure of how that money ended up getting appropriated and spent. And it had much less immediate bang for the economic stimulus buck than it might have had. And that would then be another example of deferring to, in this case, Congress to, sort of carry forward the broad mandate of designing a stimulus package rather than getting out there in front oneself.
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical of that narrative just because I think that a lot of the stuff they wanted to do, like infrastructure, while good stuff to do, is stuff that's not quick. And so that I'm not, channeling that stuff. I think ultimately you wanted to jam as much through the tax system, the unemployment system, and the welfare system as possible, because that's how you get the money out into people's hands immediately and spent. Even though I understand the arguments about the relative multipliers, I think speed was kind of the essence. But yeah, no, I think that ultimately, and it was fine for a while, right? But I think he wants to be liked too. I mean, this is obviously cheap distance psychologizing, but I think he wants to be liked too much. I don't think he's willing to just have people really just dislike him. And, the Republicans are always going to, but you have to be willing to say to the voters, maybe you're going to hate me for this, but it's the right thing to do, rather than expecting someone else to always lean into the strike zone and take one for the team. Because ultimately you have to, at some point, be seen as a guy who has ideas that he gets done. Because who wants to elect someone who is just a vessel for Congress, right? We don't like them. We like them even less than we like him pretty fine considering the economy. We really don't like Congress. So I think it's a mistake in a lot of ways. And I think that this crisis really played it up. I mean, his approval ratings just plummeted.
So I heard falling 15 points or so.
They were at 50 and they went down to 40 in Gallup anyway.
Yeah, and I heard someone remark just the other day that in 95, 96, when Clinton was in this opposition with the Republicans, just the opposite happened. his approval rating went up by 15 points between the time the conflict started and the time that Clinton emerged victorious over Newt Gingrich and that government shutdown.
I haven't looked at that, but I wouldn't be, it wouldn't surprise me to find out that was the case. So I think that, I think he needs to be more forceful. I mean, and I think maybe part of it is that Clinton was a governor and Bush was a governor. Most of these guys are governors where you're out front, and he's always been a senator where you're one of a committee, right? So if anything happens, the whole committee gets in trouble. And that's just not what the presidency is. You have to be willing to say, like, the buck stops here. And so I don't know. What are your thoughts? Are you disappointed in him? Are you pleased with the way that?
I'm way past disappointed. I was one of those people who was not entirely put off by Cornel West's vitriolic criticisms of the president. He called the president what do you call him, a mascot and a puppet of corporate interests and Wall Street interests and so forth. And the president's conduct of the foreign policy and the war on terror has not been something that, in the Guantanamo stuff and the U.S. arrogating to itself the right to kidnap or murder or, eliminate anybody anywhere on the planet that we think is in our way kind of policies. No, the lack of bold leadership, the lack of a kind of strongly articulated center-left vision about the purposes of government and whatnot, the lack of tactical acuity, getting out the new time and again in various situations. No, I haven't been all that happy with how the president has conducted himself in office, even though I grant that it's an extremely difficult job to execute.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely possible, right, to blame him for, Matt Iglesias has been saying this a lot, that look, he had a Republican opposition in Congress that wasn't going to let him do everything he wanted. And I think that that's true. I mean, I think there's a limit to how much you can say, well, if only we'd had the public option and all of these things that, he wasn't going to get, I think, that much more than he wanted. But I think that the process, in a lot of ways, right, how much time did we waste on the healthcare bill? You got the worst recession in history, and the president spent a year doing a healthcare bill. He just took a year off.
Yep, and he got the Tea Party as the kind of
right,
jackpot and a surprise, and the cracker jackpots out of that one.
So I think that the whole process was just, they should have had a better idea of what they wanted and actually push forward with it rather than leaving it up to Congress. Even though I was opposed to the bill. I mean, I'm just saying, sort of tactically, in terms of getting what he wanted, I think his presidency so far would have been a lot more successful, even if it hadn't gotten a much more radical healthcare bill, gotten a much more whatever. But it would have been more successful if he had been in control of events rather than kind of leading from behind, I guess is the...
Oh, that's good. That one's going to follow him to his political grave, I fear.
Yes. But we should move it. Speaking of healthcare, we should talk about your knee surgery.
Okay, why don't we conclude this wonderful conversation with me reporting that I come from a long line of cripples. I mean to say, people who have, quote, bad knees, proverbially, get to be 55, 60, I'm 62, and suddenly they're hobbled, and, it's just arthritis and in the knee joint, which is a kind of hereditary trait that I've inherited. So I got bad knees, so both the left and the right knee are basically shot. When I went into the surgeon's office with the x-rays and the CAT scans and all that, and he's looking at the images and he says, man, you need two new knees, not one, but two. I'm ready to go
on
soon.
One leg or both legs?
Both legs. He wants to replace both of these knees, and the left knee has been replaced. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about maybe over the Christmas break, or maybe I'll wait until next summer to do the right knee, but that both knees need to be done. Now, I knew that I had a knee problem in that I like to bike and I like to walk for exercise and for recreation, and I'd gotten to the point where I couldn't take long walks anymore because there was just too much pain in the knees. Okay? I long since gave up shooting baskets or jogging or anything ridiculous like that. The issue would just be able to take a 2-hour walk, just walk up into the woods somewhere. And I couldn't do it. I've been reduced to just biking. So my very humble ambition is to try to be able to walk again. Walk for pleasure, walk without constraint. and I've taken my first step along the way. So briefly, it's a massive surgery where the guy cuts open your leg, saws off the end of 3 bones, fits a prosthetic device to them, moves muscles apart, doesn't actually cut through any tendons or anything like ligaments or anything like that, but a lot of stuff gets moved around. Then it gets put back in place and you get stapled up. And that bad boy has to heal, and it swells, and there's pain, and they have you taking all these pain-killing, narcotic, oxycontin, oxycodone, addictive, mind-dulling things. But you take them because the pain is just unbearable. But the pain subsides after some days, and they want you moving the joint right away. I mean, within, 48 hours of the surgery, there was a physical therapist in there talking about, can you move your leg? Can you lift your leg? Can you bend it like this? Can you, it's excruciating pain. They still try to get me to move it. The pain subsides, the physical therapy goes on, and, I've still got a long way to go before I'll be able to use the knee as per normal. But I'm well on the path now, 5 weeks into it, healing up very nicely, and of good spirits. That's my report.
Well, it has all sorts of interesting healthcare implications, right? Because we're now doing a ton of these, and there are apparently...
I hear there's 600,000 knee replacements done a year. That's what I hear.
They are, what really surprised me was finding out that it's apparently more traumatic than a hip replacement, which you wouldn't think, right?
No, but I've been told that too, that the hip replacement is actually less onerous, and the recovery from hip replacement less demanding than from knee. That I've heard.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I'm going to have my hips replaced. So.
Oh. My surgeon
One's in my family.
My surgeon, the guy John Wright is his name here in Boston, who did my knee surgery, does 300 knee replacement procedures a year. 300. Yeah.
Right.
So I was very glad to hear that he had a very high rate of doing the procedure, because I figured that meant that he'd probably be pretty good at doing mine. On the other hand, it just boggles the mind that this is such a huge enterprise.
But a very expensive enterprise. And this is one of the questions that, as we do entitlements, when you talk about provider cuts, what Britain does is look at how many years you're going to get out of this knee. Are we going to do it now with easy call when you're 40 or 60, less easy call when you're 70, hard call if you're 75, et cetera. Yep. And these are, I think I listen to stories like this, and I'm just amazed at the transformation. Because do you remember, your grandparents going through this before knee replacements?
No.
Before
knee replacements.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Where they were just crippled, right?
That's what I was saying. In my family, people after people, they basically were hobbling around and, crawling upstairs and, just crippled. Exactly.
And this is the progress, but it's hugely expensive progress.
Yeah.
And, this is the conversation we haven't had yet, right?
Oh, I see. So the fact that it has to be rationed, given that it's progress and expensive, but that it's expensive and therefore you can't afford it for everybody or in every case or at every one, there's got to be some mechanism for the decision-making about limiting access to the procedure.
Or we can afford this, but maybe then we can't afford something else. Maybe we can't afford to extend the life of cancer patients by 2 months, which is it's a huge issue with things like pancreatic cancer, where you've got this really short life expectancy.
Yeah.
And these drugs that are super expensive, and people will say, well, it only extends your life by 2 months. And I think about it, if I only had 4 months to live, I would pay anything for a 2-month life expectancy. That's a 50% extension.
Unless you were spending your patrimony or matrimony, as the case might be, unless you were taking from your grandchildren and such, their college educations were going down the drain for your last 4 years of life or something like that. With that incentive, you might make a different decision.
But this is the core problem, is that it's disguised, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
One by one, we're taking it from everyone's grandkids, but we can't see it because it's only one.
Right.
And this is I think ultimately the source of this epic battle we've been talking about. But closing thoughts, Glenn? Any?
Well, I'm glad it's over and that the good faith and credit of the United States has been preserved. I didn't buy the hype with respect to the narrative on the debt ceiling thing that maybe you did buy this, that you said a bunch of hostage-taking Republicans were holding the government over the edge of the cliff, threatening to drop us off into oblivion unless they got their way. I thought it was a much more nuanced and, in a way, interesting, if bizarre and irrational piece of political theater, but very interesting, because I think the tectonic plates are shifting, on the general political alignments, and there are big and important political stakes, even though the particular, kind of procedural issue of getting the Congress to agree to a debt extension or else not being able to pay our bills seemed absurd. So I don't know if that amounts to final thought, but that's what occurs to me.
Well, I'll close by saying that I think that you're right, and that to me the real thing, I was yelling at Republicans, I was yelling at Democrats, I was yelling at almost everyone at some point during this and saying it's not that easy. But I think that the real thing that got lost was the extent to which what was happening in the Republican Party was about voters, and it wasn't about 87 terrorists. It was about the fact that their voters really did send them to Washington to do this.
Right.
And I think their voters are wrong in many, many ways, right? About the feasibility of doing this and about what it would mean to cut. I don't think they understand what would have to be cut in order to do this. But they were responding to a real, as you say, a tectonic shift in the American public. And I don't think we know where all the little continents are going to end up yet. But I think we're going to be a little seasick until it all shakes out.
Yeah, it would be interesting to watch. And so nice talking with you, Megan.
Yes.
And by the way, thank you, and I apologize for having to cancel on a previous occasion or two. I appreciate your patience.
Believe me, it sounds even worse now that you've described it. So I'm glad that you are feeling better.
Yeah, the dark days are behind me.
And we have many blogging heads to come from you, thanks to the miracle of modern healthcare.
Very good, very good. Okay, so you take care, and we'll talk again soon.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.